Good afternoon/evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Fast Tackle 103. The first thing about if you're going to be a dedicated Fast Tackle pilot is you want to have reships available ahead of time. Fast Tackle is a high casualty rate work field, I suppose you could say. They're frigates, they do get popped. It's important that you have reships available to get back into the fight. I'd say if you don't have at least 10 frigates ready to go right now, then you're not prepared to be a tackle pilot, especially if they're the T1 Atrons. They're very cheap for those Atrons, especially the ones I linked in the fleet chat for you earlier. It's like $1 million, $2 million is tops. And also, if you fly interceptors, dictors, or assault frigates, it's always good to have like 6 or 7 of those ready to go at any time and keep that stock up to the level. Because particularly, it's not so important when we're casually doing fleets like normally, like it's kind of a low tempo at the moment. But if we get back into major stratops again over objectives like soft timers, those are going to be very intense fights happening over large areas of space and for long durations. You can't always rely on the market to have the full restock availability, especially if people are actually dying in big fights. You need to have those ships prepared ahead of time. So you can die, reship, die, reship, die, reship, and keep doing that all night long to win the objective. Having billions of ISK and liquid ISK doesn't help you if you have no ships available to get out into the fight and actually win the timers. So one of the more advanced things for flying tackle is to look at your opponents to see where they're going, because they're moving around, they're trying to escape from you. If you're trying to get ahead of them or get where they're going before they do, it's important to see where they're headed. If you activate the tactical overlay, which is Control plus D as in dog keyboard shortcut, or on your HUD next to your capacitor to the left of it, it's the first column, second row icon. It adds a bunch of lines in space in the horizontal plane radius, gives you a quick look at distances in kilometers, very helpful for that. But also it shows you ship's velocity arrows. So I'm going to start micro-warp driving around grid here on the Fortizar. If you left click on my ship, I'm Harold Magnuson in the Ares here on grid, you can see this big blue arrow coming out of my ship. The length of the arrow is relative to the velocity I'm traveling at, the speed, and the direction is the direction I'm traveling in. So if you right click look at my ship, you can focus and you can see when you left click on it to make it a selected item, you can see my velocity arrow in blue. So this will, especially on bigger fleets, if you have the tactical overlay on, you can see all velocity arrows from the hostile ships. When they make a big turn, for example, you can see where they're turning towards or where they're aligning towards. This is also helpful for smaller individual ships to see where they're going if you're trying to line up an approach. So the angle you warp in from is important for tackle for where you land relative to hostile ships, and also the direction they're traveling in, because warping takes time. Even if you warp to 0 at a bookmark as they're touching it, if they're micro warp driving themselves, they're going to be past it, a dozen, 2 dozen kilometers by the time you land, even in a frigate. So trying to estimate and set up your position so that you arrive at a good distance at a good angle relative to where they're going helps you get closer to them to land the tackle. This was more a thing during the big war in Delve, but if there's ever a situation where there are multiple fleets that are on the same side, like this might happen if we're allied with toilet paper for a certain operation, and you're able to get tackle on somebody away from the main fleet, your fleet can warp to you directly because they're in the same fleet, but the other allied fleet is unable to. The way you can help with that is to drop a can or a cargo container in space. Any ship can do this at any time, as long as you have at least 1 unit of something in your inventory. I usually bring a couple rounds of T1 ammunition or maybe 1 piece of my nanite repair paste, which you can separate from a stack by holding shift and left clicking and dragging in your inventory window. So now I've got 1 nanite paste separated in my ship inventory, and if I were to warp over to, like an example, one of my tacticals here on grid, if I, for example, get tackle on somebody, assuming there's a hostile ship over here, what I can do is I can drop a cargo container. You do this by right-clicking on the single stack or item in your inventory, and right-clicking and left-clicking on the jettison option. There's a little yellow exclamation point next to it. You'll get a pop-up box asking you, are you sure about it? You hit yes or enter. And you should see on your overview now next to my ship a cargo container appeared. I'll broadcast it to the target so you guys can see it. If you don't see it, you need to change your overview settings to make sure that you're showing all brackets. I recommend having all brackets on so you can see all the relevant objects in space that you can warp to and interact with. Cargo containers are warpable objects. Wrecks are warpable objects. MTUs are warpable objects. Anchored bubbles are warpable objects. And once you land, prop mod on, just start flying around in circles or anchor up on Herald if you want. There is a hostile stiletto still on grid, and those hostiles are possibly still in system. They can warp to that cargo container, same as all of you guys. So don't hold still, spread out. Now, corpses are not by themselves warpable objects. However, if you right-click on a corpse, you can save its location. I think there might be a couple over on the R2 gate. Let me see. No, actually, I don't see any. Those are just NPC wrecks. But if there are corpses, there's usually a corpse next to a wreck if somebody got potted. What you can do is right-click on the corpse and save its location. It'll say save biomass as location. You can create a bookmark there. Same thing with the cargo container and all the wrecks. So whenever you see a wreck or a corpse or a cargo container in a position that might be useful for you in the future of the fight as a warpable location, right-click Save Bookmark. And you should be continuously saving bookmarks as fights are going on, as you're warming around. Excuse me, flying around in space, making tactical bookmarks yourself, both at your own location, several hundred kilometers away from the action, and also on wrecks as they appear in good locations. Fleets on both sides will tend to be angling themselves and manually piloting on their FC's part away from inline warps from celestial objects to avoid other tacklers from the other side getting easy warp-ins on them. So they'll be flying away from celestial objects generally. So it's harder for you to get warp-ins on the hostile fleet if they're doing the same thing. But whenever our fleet scores a kill and creates a wreck where their fleet is, if you click on that right-click save location, that can be useful later in the fight if they loop around to the similar area. Or even if they don't, having more points in space, because you can always warp to your friendly fleet, but they're not always going to be close to brawling range with the hostile fleet. So making bookmarks from both sides, the wrecks, can be very helpful for repositioning later on. At the higher skill and ISK level for flying fast tackle, once you have all skills to level 5 when you're flying interceptors or assault frigates or interdictors, the only way to improve your ship's abilities is with either blingy modules. You can go, some people run abyssals, the really kitey nanogain guys, or sometimes faction or dead space mods if you have the ISK. But even if you don't, for a couple million ISK, you can get some basic implants and boosters drugs. I've been running a 1% velocity implant for a little while, and I also I started running overclocker dose 2s, but baseline overclocker dose 1s are easy to start. They're less than a million ISK each, and they give you I think it's 3% velocity bonus for 30 minutes, which is up to an hour if you have biology 5. So it's a very useful way to get a little extra kick out of your ship, and it really shines when you start overheating things to get that higher velocity bonus. Because your goal is to be the fastest thing on grid as a fast tackler if you want to be a really good one. That way you can catch other fast tackle in certain situations. Of course, speed isn't everything. You do have to also survive once you tackle somebody. So like if you're flying an assault frigate or an interceptor, you have options with local reps. T1 frigates generally just die quietly and hold on as long as you can. You don't have the hit points or the resistances to warrant shield reps. It just takes away from largely saving much bigger, more valuable, important ships. But what you can also do is you can bounce out of a tackle once somebody else has caused a secondary. So for example, if I'm the first to catch somebody and I've got him tackled, but he's actually killing me with either light drones or rapid light missiles or something, or he's got a web and a scram on me as well, as long as other tackles coming in, I put W's in fleet, I say I've got so many tackles so-and-so system, and if backup says they're on the way, once somebody else says they also have the target scrammed, then if I'm able to, I can start trying to escape and save myself. Because by that point, generally the main fleet is even only a couple seconds away once other tackle starts to land, generally. So you can start thinking about saving yourself to avoid dying. It's more useful to be alive later in the fight than it is to die holding down one target if someone else is also tackling at the same time. If they still haven't tackled, it's okay for you to leave. So have your exit in mind. Have your camera pointed toward either a celestial object like an asteroid belt or toward the tactical you've already made on grid earlier. And if you're able to dictate your range from the target to a wider orbit at the edge of your scram or point or web range, that way you're more easily able to escape. Even if you can't micro warp drive, you can double click away from the target, try to spiral out slowly, and escape their scram or web range, then warp off and then come back if you have to. A useful skill to have is to drop a bookmark as you land from warp. You do this by hitting Control B on your keyboard. B as in boy. Bring up the new location window. You can label it whatever you like, tack whatever based on whatever grid you're landing on. I generally call them far inline because I'm, landing from an inline from another celestial. And I try to time it so that they're at least, 200, 300 kilometers plus, up to a couple thousand kilometers is fine as long as it's on the same grid. And you can drop those as you're landing in warp. You just have to watch the distance to your destination to get the timing right. And try to wait until the grid starts to load if you can recognize those effects, if there are ships on grid. The time it takes, the timing depends on the ship with your warp speed. So interceptors are faster than frigates, so they have different timing cadences to dropping bookmarks when you land on grid. In order to drop this bookmark, after you type in the name, you can either click submit at the bottom or press enter. However, the window has to be active. What that means is if you open the window, type something in, but then, for example, if you changed your camera, left click and drag your camera around or click on something else on a different window, that new location window loses focus. If you press enter on the keyboard, it won't submit it. But if you click back into it, then the window's active again. You can press enter to quickly place the bookmark or click submit with your mouse. This is super useful for if you're landing into a fight or just any grid really. Having the ability for an instant tactical that you dropped along in warp, you can separate yourself from the main fleet right away and start burning further tacticals from that distance. You want to make this into kind of like a muscle memory thing, so that every time you do it, you're dropping a bookmark as you land from warp to give you warpable back from the way you came. And as you all should know, maybe you don't, but the minimum warpable distance is 150 kilometers. For a fast tackle, you want to be at least 200 kilometers between every bookmark, maybe 250 or 300, because that gives you more room to maneuver around each bookmark and still be able to warp to the other ones. You don't always have to give them fancy names. Sometimes I just do numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever, with a 3-hour expiry in my general fleet folder. As long as you're on grid, you can look around and find your other bookmarks. But if you want to organize them so that you can warp to them from off-grid easily, that is useful to have. To know what grid it's on and what the relevant distances and directional orientations are. Like if it's a far inline tack, it's along the same warp line from major celestials like stargates or fortizars, but still warpable distance away from the object, maybe not far enough away to avoid a bubble. Bubbles will affect warp distances within 500 kilometers. So if your tactical isn't 510 or 520 kilometers away from the object you're warping to, a bubble at 0 on it will still catch you. For these kind of tactical examples. Like even the one I'm sitting at, I'm only 397 kilometers from the customs office. If I wanted a real far inline tack the way I consider naming them to qualify, it would have to be like 600 plus kilometers to avoid bubbles at 0 or up to 100 from the customs office itself in the same inline. Of course, the better tacticals are always out of line to avoid bubbles. So, from this point, you'd burn up, down, left, right, or sideways diagonally to make better tacticals to avoid the warp lines and bubble traps. So Zach, if there's an ongoing fight, you don't need to make them all 500 plus. I mean, that's ideal if you have the time for it. But if things are spicy, drop one at 350 or 300 is fine. Of course, the 500 plus ones are best because that way it dissuades people from trying to burn towards you to steal your tactical. Because if I'm sitting with a friendly fleet and I see a hostile warp in at a couple hundred kilometers and then warp out, if I'm quick to approach their point in space, I can just copy their bookmark when I get to that same distance in kilometers away pretty easily. But if it's 500 plus kilometers, it's not worth the time generally for me to try and do that. Speaking of warpable distances and positioning for tacks, it's important whenever you're going for tackle that you're aware of where the how far away the main fleet is in regards to both getting Logi revs potentially if you're flying a T2 ship and also their own ability to kill the target you've tackled. In brawling situations, it's nice and easy because both fleets are close together, but in the more kitey situations where both fleets are maybe jousting with each other and flying around independently, it's very easy for your main fleet to get separated from the hostile fleet. If you're diving on the hostile fleet, you may find yourself all alone very quickly. So it's important to think about the situation of where their friendly fleet is. If they're hitting the hostile fleet, if they're killing the hostile fleet, that's a good time to get tackle on somebody, because it'll help. Especially the primary, if you're able to web and scram the primary target, they'll die much faster. But if the friendly fleet is, for example, trying to extract or is kiting away from the hostile fleet, that's a bad time to commit because you're just going to die all by yourself. There was an engagement recently, I think it was yesterday or so, where we warped in close to the hostile fleet, but then our fleet peeled away immediately, and so did the hostile fleet. And the Dictors committed on the hostile fleet, but at least one of them died in a fire because they were too far away from friendly Logi, and the FC wasn't close enough to actually take advantage of the bubbles to kill the hostiles. So consider your impact of the effect and how if backup is able to get to you. That's very important also for warpable distances, because if you catch somebody who's 100 kilometers away from the main fleet, there's nothing they can do about it really soon in a short order. Yes, they can burn the 100 kilometers with the micro warp drives, but they might not be able to do that. The situation may not be untenable. There could be a hostile fleet, on top of them as well. They're busy fighting. So look for things that you can tackle that are over 150 kilometers away from both the friendly fleet, so maybe they can warp to you to help you kill it, or other tacklers who can warp in at a quick moment's notice. This is why you yourself want to be at tacticals at all times, several hundred kilometers away. So if hostiles land on top of the fleet, or someone else tackles something, you can warp to them directly and be on top of them in short order to either defensively tackle away hostile tacklers or get secondary tackle on something else somebody else caught. This is what the FC means when he says tackle spread out or EWAR spread out and make pings. It means prop mod on a direction somebody else isn't already traveling. And then after you're several hundred kilometers away, drop a bookmark in Brave temporary. The temporary bookmarks folder for Brave is this one I'll link it for you in Fleet Chat. Always make sure you make bookmarks for 3-hour expiry or occasionally 2-day expiry when you put them in that folder. You will see the bookmark immediately, but it takes a couple minutes for everybody else to see the bookmark for it to populate across other people into the shared folder. Now, the ESS is a very popular location for fleets to run to, or even hostile single ships to run to, because of the way the ESS grid works. The initial acceleration gate grid cannot be warped to anywhere other than the ESS itself. So if a Dictor or a Hictor puts a bubble up at 0, there's no way to warp to it that you won't get caught in the bubble and dragged to 0, unless you're an interceptor and you have interdiction nullification or something. Now, DScan is a powerful tool that lets you determine where ships are that are off-grid, but within 14.3 AU distance. So by setting your DScan to 5 degree and then focusing your camera on distant objects, you can tell basically if somebody's at that location. Now there are two parts to the ESS. There's this entrance grid, the acceleration gate here, and there's also the inside, which is the ESS itself. Now even though frigates cannot jump through the acceleration gate, it has to be cruiser or larger to go into the site itself, but your DScan will work just fine. So if you point your camera down towards the same direction the acceleration gate is going, set your DScan to like 1 AU distance and like 30 degree angle, you will be able to see the results of any ships that are inside the ESS. So right now there's nobody, but if there was somebody, they'd show up on DScan. That's a useful trick to know. So about the ESS grid, everybody prop mods on Starburst. On this grid, you cannot warp to anybody else or anything else. So Killjoy's over there is 170 kilometers away from me. If I try to warp to him, I cannot. You get a little message in-game that says you cannot do that, natural phenomena disrupting it. This makes the ESS a great place to hide if you're the first one there, because you can just prop mod on away from the warp endpoint, and the only way for somebody to get to you is to fly over there themselves. Now, as a tackler, that means that the normal tactic of catching somebody really quickly and then having your friendly fleetmates warp to you is impossible here. Even if you do burn away and catch somebody, if they try to warp to you, they will land on the acceleration gate at 0 instead of on top of you. So it's a terrible place to try and tackle somebody unless the whole fleet is with you right next to you. MJDs do work, yes. So if you're a battlecruiser or a battleship, you can use a micro jump drive to move around, or the command destroyers can also boost around this grid. So in order to tackle somebody on an ESS, you have to either be here before they are, either with a bubble or at some range and a quick response when they land, or you have to warp after them very quickly and get lucky with their range guess. So there's two things I can talk about related to that. The first is tackling somebody as they land from warp. Now the way this technique works is, and I use it most often during soft campaigns, where I'm sitting on a node defensively, trying to tackle hostile ships or U-War frigates and griffins as they land to try and disrupt our entosis. As a ship is landing on grid, a hostile ship, as soon as they appear in your overview, you are able to right-click approach or right-click orbit, or use your hotkeys A or W and left-click on the ship on the overview. Either if you're able to get their icon in space with the bracket, but most usually from the overview list on the right. You can then activate your prop mod or start, if you've got it preheated, start running a hot prop mod right away. So even if they land at range where you wouldn't normally be able to tackle them, if you responded after they exited warp, if you're already moving as soon as you see them appear on grid while they're still warping themselves, you could potentially cross the distance much faster and catch them, where otherwise you wouldn't be able to. Now the ability to catch somebody who warps at 100 from 0 relies on your max top speed. So having a double overdrive Atron, for example, or an interceptor, having those drugs and implants for velocity bonuses makes the difference on whether or not you can catch somebody based on how fast you can go. How many seconds does it take you to travel 50, 60, 70 kilometers? You'll get a sense for that as you fly a ship around and try to overheat and catch people, what ranges you're able to catch them at. It also depends on if you have a long point or not. Because interceptors are great for fast tackle because they have a bonus to long point and short scram range. For example, I can overheat my Tech 2 warp disruptor and get 36 kilometers. That's before links. And the reason I say target as soon as possible is because when you're flying at top speed, especially overheated, the delay between targeting is, even though it's short for a frigate, the distance you would travel in that second or two often means that you're in point range or scram range, depending if you're a smaller frigate, by the time target lock lands. So you want to be spamming target lock first as you're approaching a target, and then also possibly using your hotkeys to activate the modules as soon as possible or pre-activate them. Because if you left click on a module before you have an active target, it brings up kind of this crosshair around your cursor and the module will begin to blink. If you then left click on a target, or you do this while you're targeting something else, it will apply as soon as you have the target acquired. Quick note about deselecting targets, you can either right click unlock target, you can hold down left click and choose the 6 o'clock direction to unlock target, or you can control shift left click to unlock a target. Now oftentimes if there's a fleet fight brawl going on and the main fleets are engaging each other, there will sometimes be smaller skirmishes between the light support stuff. Like there isn't always a dedicated light fleet, but there might be individuals flying like T3Ds or assault frigates with DPS. Or sometimes T3Cs, you'll see occasional individual Tengus or Legions for something, or Lokis maybe flying around trying to pick off smaller stuff. So if somebody's combat scanning probing you, or combat scanning you with combat scanner probes, for example like a Hekate, I've run into several hunting Hekates who will try to chase down individual frigates during fleet fights. While your micro warp drive is running, frigates have a signature radius large enough that they are scannable. Now if you're prop mod on at full speed, and you're flying away from where that Hekate is coming from, by the time he lands you should be far enough away that he's unable to tackle you. But he can still shoot you if he's a rail Hekate. Blaster Hekates not so much. So to a point you are safe as long as you're micro warp driving, as long as you're fast enough. but long-range ships will still be able to hit you and chase you down potentially. So there's two ways to avoid this. The first is to be aware of hostile ships if they're warping in next to you. If you can either overheat and just burn straight away from them, depending on the ship type they are, or if your reaction time is good, you can warp off to some other bookmark. The other thing you can do is if your ship has a small signature radius by itself, which most frigates do, if you turn off your micro-warp drive, then your signature radius should get to the point where most people cannot scan you down, unless they're running bonus ships with very good skills. So I know the Troll Toasting Atron, and it depends on the ship type, I don't know what the numbers are, but I think most frigates, unless they have a bunch of shield extenders, and maybe some assault frigates won't qualify for this, but I know interceptors like my Ares, if I turn off my micro-warp drive, I am too small to scan for most combat scanner ships, the default ones without any bonuses. So as long as I'm at a far enough away distance that I can't be chased down quickly by other interceptors micro-warp drives, I'm essentially safe sitting several hundred kilometers away without my prop mod running, because they're unable to combat scan me. And that depends on if there's combat scanners present or not. You are holding still, so you're not making any more new bookmarks, which is a bad thing. You want to be making more bookmarks if possible, but something to consider if there's someone hostily or actively combat scanning you down trying to kill you. Turning off your prop is one method to shrink your signature radius to the point they can't get a good hit on you in full result. Let's talk about something fun. This involves this method of chasing down people with your tactical overlay for the velocity arrows. If you're trying to chase down another fast mover like another frigate or a very kitey cruiser, nanogang cruiser, as long as you're slightly faster than they are, there's a technique you can use. So this is a situation where you're not able to get close to somebody, but they're flying like at an angle. If you want to chase down that person, for example, if I turn this direction, if you just right-click approach on my ship at this point, if I'm moving fast enough, then the way the game calculates the distances and your navigation updates, you will kind of trail behind as you approach. This takes you the longer way around to try and catch somebody. The way to catch somebody who's also fast is to point yourself towards where they're going as well. So if you left click on my ship in space, you should see my blue velocity arrow pointing along out in space. And what you want to do is fly yourself along a similar path towards that arrow, but also intersecting me at some point in the future. Aim not for where I am, but ahead of where I'm going towards that line. This is for catching other people who are close to your speed, where you're not able to easily just right-click approach and overpower them with a major difference in velocity. But other interceptors, other frigates, other fast cruisers who are going several thousand meters per second, you have to manually pilot in advance of where they're going in order to catch up to them. Oh yeah, that's a great application for this as well. If you're trying to catch somebody who prototype cloaks after they jump through a Stargate and you're sitting at 0 on the other side, when you've got the tactical overlay going, you can see their velocity direction even if it's just for a second or two. So you double click in front of their ship towards where they were going by a few thousand meters, because their ship's going to be moving, especially if they do the micro-warp drive trick. It's not going to be where they last disappeared, it's going to be in front of them along the line they were going is where they're going to be. So that's where you manually pilot towards to decloak them. It's like leading a target if you're shooting at something that's moving. You got to aim ahead of where it's going, because when the bullet travels through the distance towards where it's also going, they meet the same point if you aim correctly. Zoom in on your own ship with the tactical overlay going, you will see both your own velocity arrow and the relative velocity arrow of the ship you have selected. So this will give you a very quick information update on the relative direction and speed that they're going towards your own ship. It's the same orientation as if you zoom out. And that plays into when you're like kind of dogfighting other scepters at medium range on a grid. Like if you're trying to chase them down or run away from them trying to chase you, you select them so you can see their relative velocity arrow, and you can see when they turn direction and when they speed up and slow down.
Got it. Thank you.
On your capacitor below your white dots for your shield and armor structure hit points, there's 3 sections between the orange and the white dots. That's your heat status. When you first overheat a module, the heat status is 0, but if for every completed hot cycle you will build up heat status up to 100%. The higher the heat status for your rack, low, medium, or high, the greater the amount of heat damage modules will take at the end of every cycle. So prop mods can only take a couple cycles of heat before they risk burning themselves out, or other modules next to them on the medium rack. Let's talk a little bit about bombing runs. When stealth bombers launch bombs, a single bomb will not kill even a Tech 1 Atron under the condition that the prop mod is off all the way. Bomb's damage application depends on your signature radius. Now when you're running a micro warp drive, it blooms your signature radius significantly, to the point where a bomb will pop frigates and even destroyers if the micro warp drives are running, even T2 ones. So if you're sitting still and a single bomber decloaks and launches a single bomb at you, you're fine to sit there. The bomb will take part of your shields off and you'll be fine. However, if your micro warp drive is running, and you're going to end up in the area of effect when the bomb when it goes off, you have to either very quickly change your velocity towards where the bomber came from, or depending on the distances involved in the geometry, away from where it came from, to avoid the area of effect, which is 15 kilometers. Bombs will travel 30 kilometers from the point they are launched from the bomber that launched them, and then their radius of effect is 15 kilometers from the point of impact. It takes like 7 or 8 or 9 seconds for the bomb to travel the distance. So there is time to react to a bomb, but not very much. So when bombers decloak en masse, either in regular wing or multiple wings, if there's multiple wings, you want to get out of there. But you have the ability, if you're prepared for it and waiting for it, to try and tackle these bombers. You can do this by either having the micro warp drive running for quick velocity acceleration, or just have your finger on the button. And by double clicking or Q clicking or orbiting one of the bombers as soon as they appear, and running the micro warp drive, you will be faster than the bomb. You can fly out of the radius of effect, which is generally where you're currently sitting with the main fleet, and hopefully tackle long point or scram the bomber and get to them, because the bomb will not detonate. The area of effect will not hit the bomber itself. So if you're able to get to the bomber before the bomb explodes, you can avoid the explosion radius effect. Or if there's multiple bombs coming and your micro warp drive is running and you're moving, best thing you can do is right click if you're not prepared to tackle them. If you're traveling the opposite direction, for example, best thing you can do is try to escape, warp off to something, turn off your micro warp drive, hopefully it red cycles or you warp off before the bomb detonates. Let's talk a little bit more about tackling somebody when they came through a gate. Generally, you'll be sitting at 0 on the other side, and you should have your modules pre-activated and overheated for extra range, because the Scram, point, and web all benefit from extra range when you overheat them. So if you're waiting for somebody to come through a gate, and you see them come in local, you saw the gate at flash activation, you know they're there. Generally, you want to have a overview tab for gate camping, where there's nothing else on the list except for potential hostile ships. So you can hover your mouse over at the top slot where they will appear. As soon as they do, you can left click, which will activate your targeting as well as your pre-activated modules as soon as the lock completes. And then quickly either A left click or W left click or right click to approach and orbit them. The best thing to do is to orbit them and have the default orbit set at 500 meters with a micro warp drive either on or quickly activated. This is because even if they cloak, because when you do an approach command, if they cloak, your ship will stop moving. But if you did an orbit command first, orbit 500 is basically approaching them. Your ship will continue to fly in a straight line at full velocity when it loses when they cloak up. This is the best way to try and decloak somebody, is to orbit 500 with a W left click, because your ships keep going full velocity when they disappear from the grid. And also to watch them with your tactical overlay on, try and find out their velocity arrow, and try to adjust at the last second, or double click in space, manually pilot, Q click maybe. You want to try to go towards where they're going, not exactly where they were when they disappeared, because they're moving as well. So Q clicking, there's two ways to manually pilot. There's double clicking, which gives you an align basically, anywhere in space. And the tactical overlay will also give you a little blue circle at the end of your align, so you can see where you're flying towards. You can also hold Q on your keyboard. This will bring up a blue line, and there's two clicks involved. The first left click gives you your distance along the horizontal plane in a direction. The second click, you can then move the mouse up and down for above and below the horizontal galactic plane, so to speak, solar plane. This will then give your ship an approach to a point. Once your ship reaches that point, it will slow down and stop. This can be useful for repositioning on tether on a structured grid. That way you can avoid accidentally flying off tether because you were only aligning to something when you double-clicked in space. If you Q-click, you will fly to and then stop at that point in space. A slingshot maneuver refers to when you are being chased by somebody who is fast enough to catch you. You're trying to escape with micro-drive running, and for example, another interceptor points you and is possibly overheating and approaching you. You can see the distance getting closer, or even just the same velocity. If you're unable to escape their long point, there's an option called the slingshot maneuver. This involves turning around and flying back in the opposite direction towards the ship that's chasing you. If you do it at the right timing, you will fly past them at full speed as they pass you at full speed. And even if you both scram each other along the way, based on how the ship's velocity or the game's velocity updates work, if they are only right-click approaching you, their ship will not begin to slow down at all until they pass you. And then it will turn around and try to catch up to you. But because you're going full speed past them when they pass you, it's possible for you to slip past them pass outside of their scram range going the other direction. And this can allow you to escape or warp off potentially. Now, if they have webs, that's a real problem because it slows you down way more than usual.
At what time are you, like, so if you're approaching me right now, at what distance are you trying to engage that slingshot?
You want to do it at a point soon enough that you're able to reach full velocity, because you want to be going to full velocity the other direction past the person approaching you. So if you do it too late, your ship's still going to be turning around and slowing down as they catch up to you. And then they're going to scram you and your ship's going to be moving too slowly. It only works if you're going full velocity straight past them before they can react to it. But also if you do it too early, they're going to notice you change direction and velocities back towards them, and they're going to adjust their own to match that and catch you. That kind of ruins it if you bump into each other, so don't fly directly towards the other ship, I guess, slightly to the left or right of them. And also if you overheat your scram, to scram them maybe a fraction of a second before they scram you, that also helps. So a drive-by scram refers to approaching a target, but then flying past it, not establishing an orbit or right-click approaching, bumping into it directly, but initiating the scram as you get close enough to it within range, then continuing on at full speed, going past the target ship. This is useful for fleet fights, where if you want to do a drive-by scram on a hostile fleet ship, but you don't want to stick around next to the hostile fleet at zero. But this still has a useful effect because they get scrammed, their micro-drive turns off, they fall behind the rest of the pack. If they don't notice, they fall behind by a lot. Maybe some other tackler catches them as well. You can see how targeting range really affects a fast tackle ship because it determines how long you have to react. This is one of the reasons interceptors are so much of an improvement over the T1 ships. They have a much larger targeting range. If you find yourself struggling to get everything done in time as you're passing somebody at high speed, that's one of the drawbacks of the T1 tackle frigates. I used this tactic on a recent fleet where they had a battleship and they got caught in a bubble on a gate, but the bubble was only at 0, so they only had 20 kilometers to burn to get to the gate. And they were trying to crash the gate, but I did a drive-by scram of their battleship, and I kept coming back to keep drive-by scramming him, and he got slowed down because he couldn't micro-warp drive towards the gate. And the fleet ended up actually engaging because the battleship couldn't escape. But I didn't commit because they were blaster, drone boat, Prexer, brawling fit kind of stuff. I could have, but I didn't. It's an option to choose one of your many choices in your arsenal of tackle. To do a drive-by scram on somebody, because it increases your own survivability. Because even if they react to being scrammed, you're already, 10 kilometers away, flying away at full speed. They don't have time to react if they don't already see you coming in ahead of time. A lot of tackling happens very quickly over a couple seconds in sequence. There's a lot of things you have to manage. Your approach, manually piloting adjustments to your approach, micro-warp drives, overheating, activating tackle modules, targeting the thing you're trying to catch. I've lost tackle on things I should have caught because I wasn't able to target them all because I was busy, manually piloting too much. The more you do it, the more you'll understand the sequence of things to do it in and the muscle memory of it, entering the keybinds and the buttons and the mouse clicks and where to put them. Right, so if, for example, you see a hostile ship escape from a grid and he warps toward either a very limited or a single celestial object, like maybe an ESS, If you see him warp off, you can call out to other tackle, hey, this guy warped with the SS, I'm going at 50. It's important for you to communicate what range you're going at so other tackle can then spread themselves out over to other ranges. Somebody else can say, okay, I'm going at 0. Third person says going at 100. That way you spread out the availability of where you land. Decrease the chances of somebody landing within point or scram range on the target. And if you are the first one to land with a hostile ship, mention what range he's at. Like if you warp at 50 and he's 50 kilometers behind you, that means he warped at 100. So say he's warped at 100, I'm burning for him. Or if you see him at 0, say he's at 0. That helps other people who haven't already warped to get closer to the target. Because even if you're able to catch them, if they're able to warp to that range immediately, instead of waiting for you to catch somebody, they're on grid faster at the right place to get secondary or support or reps or to deal damage. So I mentioned earlier, bubbles have an effect of a range of 500 kilometers if your path of travel intersects them. If your path of travel does not intersect them, if you have a tactical bookmark above, behind, left to right, diagonal, somewhere other, you will not get hit by the bubble. D-scan is your most useful tool for finding bubbles ahead of time. You should check your settings if you don't already have them to make sure that it shows interdictor probe bubbles and also anchored mobile bubbles. That way you can see if the dictor is bubbling a gate or if it's just sitting at 0, and if there's any anchored bubbles before you land on grid. If you're flying interceptor, you have the option of using the interdiction nullifier to avoid bubbles entirely. If you don't already have a tactical bookmark on a gate or a grid somewhere, the best thing you can do to avoid bubbles is by warping in from a different celestial object at a different angle. So you can find angles by kind of roughly just panning your camera around in space and doing some estimations with distances and angles. Or you can open your in-game solar system map to look at your target destination and pan the camera around to find relative angles for most common approaches. Because most bubbles will be anchored in line with stargates or perhaps major structures. So if you come from like the sun, maybe, or a planet, or even a cosmic anomaly, a ratting site or a mining site that's very offline from stargates or out of line with those things, then you can avoid the bubbles generally. If you do find yourself landing inside of a bubble, the best thing you can do is overheat your micro warp drive and either burn through it if it's at 0 on a gate and just jump through, because you're fast enough you can cover 20 kilometers in 1 or 2 seconds, and even if they scram you, you should already be at full speed approaching the gate. You can coast the last couple thousand meters and get through the stargate most times. Now, if they have other fast tackles sitting waiting for you at the edge of the bubble, there's not much you can do. But if they're not already set up for you, you'd be surprised how quickly you can escape by overheating the prop mod and burning away outside the bubble, and then quickly warping off to something else. Also, it's important to notice when the fights are happening where the bubbles are on grid. If you're trying to get a warp in on somebody, of course if there's bubbles between you and them, you're going to hit the bubble first. This is why it's so important to try and build tacticals at various angles and directions around a grid beforehand or during the fight. That gives you options to reposition. Sometimes even if you have to hit the bubble, the direction you come in from makes a big difference because there's a 20-kilometer radius on those. So what side you hit is a 40-kilometer distance difference sometimes where you end up. Bubbles can be boosted by command destroyers. It's a tricky tactic to pull off, but it is possible with great coordination to have a saber or other dictor and a boosher working together, where they warp in at 100 from a hostile fleet, bubble themselves, then chain boost themselves with some other boosters onto the fleet with the bubble, and then again boost themselves on the bubble somewhere else to catch the fleet inside a bubble, or boost the bubble on top of them and leave it there. Which is hilarious if it works out, but very difficult to pull off. Thank you all for coming out. Hope you learned something. Have a good day/evening. And I'll see you around in space.